It began, as many of my cases did, with silence. Not the sort one meets in the dead of night, but that peculiar Oxford stillness that falls between terms when the students have gone and the stones themselves seem to rest from their duty of echoing ambition. I remember walking through the quadrangle of St. Ambrose that afternoon, the air thin with drizzle, the flagstones darkened to the colour of forgotten ink. Somewhere a bell tried to ring, faltered, and gave up. I had no business there, at least not yet. The porter had nodded to me with that mixture of deference and curiosity reserved for those who have once made trouble and are expected to do so again. He said there had been a death, though his tone made it sound more like an inconvenience than a tragedy. Academic deaths rarely rouse alarm. They occur quietly in libraries or lodgings, among piles of unmarked essays and unopened wine bottles. The man in question was Dr. Stephen Markham, Fellow of English Literature, and by all accounts not particularly liked. His body had been found earlier that morning, seated at his desk, his head bowed as though still reading. The nurse from the college infirmary had pronounced it a heart attack. Natural causes. Everyone's favourite phrase when curiosity seems indecent. I ought to have left it there. I had a crossword folded inside my pocket, an unfinished pint waiting for me at Randolph, and a promise to myself not to meddle in university affairs again. Yet something about the word natural troubled me. I have always distrusted it. Nature, after all, is indifferent to tidy conclusions. The study door was open. A policeman I half knew, from previous entanglements, stood awkwardly by the fireplace, trying not to brush soot on his trousers. He asked what I thought, and I told him I thought very little, which was not quite true. There was the scent of burnt paper in the air, faint but deliberate, and the edge of an envelope half charred in the grate. Someone had been eager to tidy up. I noticed, too, the crossword lying on the desk, half completed, the last clue unanswered, 5 letters, a moral examination. Beneath it, a pen still uncapped. Lewis would later say that I stared too long at small things, but it has always been in the small things that people hide themselves. A misused semicolon, an overlong stare, a faint trace of aftershave on a page. In this room, something resisted the finality of death. On the mantelpiece was a photograph of 3 men in gowns, smiling the hollow smiles of those forced to commemorate success. I recognized one of them, Markham himself, another was the dean, and the third, a woman who had once written to the Times protesting the exclusion of female lecturers from senior posts. Her name escaped me then, though her eyes, even in the photograph, refused to be forgotten. I waited until the room cleared and the porter resumed his vigil. Outside, rain tapped against the mullioned windows, insistent as guilt. I traced the crossword clue again in my mind, a moral examination, 5 letters, test, ethics, trial, none fitted quite right. Then it came to me, softly, like something long overheard. Viva! An oral examination, not written, but spoken, a test of mind and nerve. I looked once more at Markham's bowed head, at the burnt letter, at the silence that filled the room like smoke. Someone had conducted a viva of their own. Later, when I walked out across the quadrangle, the rain had ceased. The bell succeeded at last in striking the hour. Somewhere behind me, a door closed with the sound of decision. That was the moment, though I did not yet know it, when the case truly began. The porter's name was Jenkins, a man whose face seemed carved from the same grey stone that framed the college gate. I had known him, in passing, for years. He had a memory for faces, less so for names, and a particular way of making you feel that every question you asked was, somehow, discourteous. When I returned later that evening, after the official inquiries had subsided and the college had resumed its habitual hush, I found him seated behind his desk, polishing a brass key that needed no polishing. He asked if I'd seen the Dean. I told him I hadn't, and didn't intend to until I had a reason that sounded respectable. Jenkins grunted. He disliked conversations that didn't end in a signature or a receipt. Behind him hung a board of hooks and numbered tags, each one representing a life within the college scholars, tutors, visiting fellows, all temporarily suspended by brass. One tag was missing Markham's. I asked when he had last seen the man. Jenkins said it was the previous evening, around 9. Markham had come down from his rooms, wearing a raincoat, though the sky had been clear. He'd asked for the gate key. Jenkins, dutiful as always, had asked how long he'd be. Markham had smiled, that dry, lopsided smile that meant nothing good, and said he wouldn't be long. He had not returned. The porter paused then, and I caught the faint smell of pipe smoke on his sleeve, old, stale, the scent of routine. He mentioned that an envelope had been delivered earlier that same day. A college messenger had brought it. No stamp, no return address. Markham had taken it without comment and gone upstairs. Jenkins remembered it because the paper had been blue, the kind reserved for formal invitations or delicate refusals. It was odd, I thought, how people recall colour when everything else fades. Blue paper, charred fragments in a grate. The persistence of detail is sometimes the only witness left. I let the silence stretch. It was not a tactic, simply the manner of men who have seen too many years of half-truths. Jenkins began to speak again, slower now. He mentioned that later that night he'd heard a door close near the cloisters. Not Markham's, but nearby. The sound had been soft but definite. Someone leaving or returning. He couldn't say he hadn't gone. To look. A porter's duty, he said, is to notice everything and interfere with nothing. A line that could have served as an epitaph for Oxford itself. When I left him, the rain had resumed, finer this time, the kind that finds its way into one's collar unnoticed. I stood for a moment beneath the archway, the smell of damp stone rising around me, and considered his words. A door closing near the cloisters, a blue envelope, a raincoat on a dry night. There is a rhythm to deceit, a pattern that only becomes audible when the noise of ordinary life subsides. Markham's absence, Jenkins's silence, the burned letter are all variations on a theme I had not yet learned to hum. I returned to my room and poured myself a whisky that tasted of varnish and regret. The crossword from earlier still lay on my desk, folded open at the same clue. A moral examination. The word lingered as though the dead man were whispering it from the far end of the quadrangle. Somewhere between the drip of the rain and the ticking of the clock, I wrote a note in my book. Blue paper, gate key, door, near cloisters. I underlined it twice, not because it meant anything yet, but because meaning has a way of ripening when left alone. Outside, the college bell tolled once more, faint, uncertain, as if embarrassed by its own persistence. And I thought again of Jenkins, sitting in his lodge, polishing the same key, waiting for someone who would never return to claim it. I met her in the Dean's garden, of all places a widow dressed in grey, though not the sort of grey that implies mourning. Hers was the shade of restraint, the colour of a woman who has learned the advantage of appearing inconspicuous. She had come, she said, to return a set of borrowed books. They lay in a basket beside her, spines faded by years of careful handling of Hardy, Browning, and a slim volume of Latin verse that had once belonged to her husband. The warden had been polite but distant, accepting them with the same grace one reserves for unwanted flowers. I had no invitation to that conversation, yet the Dean's secretary had a fondness for small transgressions and allowed me through the side gate. The grass was wet, and the sound of my shoes against the flagstones startled a pigeon from the sundial. The widow turned at the sound, her expression poised between curiosity and suspicion. I introduced myself only as a man assisting the police, a phrase that always sounds more ambiguous than it ought to. She asked, quietly, whether Dr. Markham's death had been an accident. I told her I wasn't certain, though the word accident rarely sits comfortably in my vocabulary. She seemed unsurprised by that answer. People who live near the academic world grow accustomed to secrets dressed as civility. Her husband, she explained, had been a lecturer in theology before his illness. He had known Markham, once admired him, even until admiration had soured into something colder. She did not elaborate, and I did not ask. Some truths reveal themselves more clearly in silence. The warden appeared soon after, his presence as deliberate as a comma in an old sentence. He was a tall, exacting man with the pale patience of one who has spent his life correcting other people's errors. He addressed me as Chief Inspector, though I had not introduced myself as such. That in itself was a curiosity. He spoke of Markham's brilliance and difficulty, of his occasional temper and unwise attachments. He did not mention the letter. I noted that omission. While he talked, I watched the widow's hands. They were still gloved, despite the mild air, and one of them trembled slightly whenever the warden said Markham's name. There was a history there, not romantic, perhaps, but shaded by something intimate, shared disillusionment, a mutual grievance, the residue of old admiration turned to pity. I remembered the photograph on Markham's mantelpiece, the woman with the unflinching eyes. It might have been her. The warden led us toward the cloister. The smell of damp stone rose like memory itself. He spoke of college traditions, of examinations and ceremonies, but his voice carried the faint edge of irritation, as if I had interrupted an arrangement he had hoped to manage quietly. He mentioned that Markham had recently been denied a promotion, something about his last publication being too speculative. I knew that phrase. It was Oxford's version of a death sentence. At the cloister's end, the widow paused to look at a plaque inscribed with names of benefactors long forgotten. Her reflection in the brass seemed almost apologetic. She asked whether I believed in forgiveness. I told her, perhaps too quickly, that forgiveness was easier to study than to practice. She smiled then, a brief, weary smile that seemed to acknowledge a truth neither of us wished to name. When they parted, she left a faint trace of lilac in the air. I followed her with my eyes until she disappeared through the gate. The warden watched too, but his gaze was harder, more calculating. He turned to me and said that grief makes people fanciful. I said nothing. Some fancies are more revealing than facts. Later, as I walked back across the quadrangle, I recalled the widow's gloved hand, trembling at a name. In my notebook I wrote a single line. "Widow knew letter." Warden feared it. I underlined it once, then again, until the ink bled slightly through the paper. Somewhere in the distance, a choir was rehearsing for evensong. Their voices rose and fell like a question without an answer. Oxford has always been a city that prefers questions. Answers, when they come, arrive too late. It was in the senior common room that I first heard the misquotation, a harmless conversation between colleagues, half-heartedly mourning the loss of one of their own over tepid coffee and the rustle of newspapers. Someone, a young lecturer in history, with a voice better suited to sermons, remarked that Dr. Markham had always reminded him of Eliot's line about measuring out one's life with coffee spoons. Another, older and altogether more self-satisfied, corrected him. "Not Eliot," he said, Auden. The younger man accepted the rebuke meekly, as people tend to do when hierarchy dresses itself in erudition. But it was Eliot, of course. And it was not the error that interested me. Academics err more often than they admit, but the way the correction had been delivered. Too quick, too certain, as though rehearsed. I had learned long ago that those who correct others too confidently are usually trying to conceal a different kind of ignorance. I lingered by the window, pretending to study the drizzle softening the stone. The conversation drifted to safer territory: exam results, research grants, the eternal complaint about undergraduates who could quote without comprehension. Yet my mind stayed with that misquoted poet. A triviality, perhaps, but in Oxford, trivialities often carry the weight of confession. The warden entered soon after, his composure as immaculate as his collar. He spoke of memorial arrangements, of donations to a scholarship fund in Markham's name. His voice had the smoothness of a man accustomed to being obeyed. When he mentioned that the late Dr. Markham had been due to lecture on moral vision in modern poetry, a ripple of irony passed through the room like a chill. Someone coughed and someone else stirred their teaspoon too loudly. It was then that I noticed her again, the widow standing in the doorway, uncertain whether to cross the threshold. She wore no hat this time, and the rain had left her hair slightly damp. The warden greeted her with formal kindness. She murmured something inaudible, then offered him an envelope. He took it without looking inside, sliding it into the inner pocket of his coat, as though the gesture itself might erase its existence. I thought of the burnt fragments I had found in Markham's grate. When the others had dispersed, I approached her. She seemed weary of condolences that disguised curiosity. I asked if she had known her husband's colleague well. Her answer came too readily. Well enough to fear him, she said, then added that it was unkind to speak ill of the dead. I told her that the dead rarely mind. She gave a faint smile, the kind that acknowledges defeat rather than amusement, and turned to leave. I noticed she carried one of Markham's books under her arm. Browning, I quoted softly after her, almost to myself. Ah, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's heaven for? She paused and replied that Markham had preferred Larkin. The bleak honesty of it, she said. I wondered whether that honesty had finally found him. Later that night, back in my rooms, I couldn't shake the image of that envelope disappearing into the warden's pocket. I poured a whiskey, turned on the lamp, and opened the notebook where I'd begun mapping. Connections. Beside the earlier entries, blue paper, gate key, cloister door, I added a new one, misquotation. Eliot, Auden, deliberate? I remembered the warden's correction again. Not a slip, but a choice. To misquote is to control interpretation, to claim ownership of words that are not one's own. In poetry, as in crime, misdirection is the first refuge of guilt. As I sat there, the sound of rain thickened against the window pane. Somewhere a clock chimed 9, then 10. I reached for the crossword, hoping to distract myself, but the clues blurred. One of them read simply, truth disguised as 6 letters. I filled in the motive without thinking, then crossed it out. Perhaps it was poetry after all. It was the choir that drew me back to the chapel that evening, not piety, certainly, but the sound of disciplined melancholy echoing across the stone. Oxford choirs have a way of turning devotion into something perilously close to regret. I stood at the back, beneath the carved angels, their faces darkened by candle soot, and listened to the boys' voices rise and tremble through Bird's Miserere. The music was precise, fragile, unbearably human. Lewis had gone home by then. He said he had an early start and that my tendency to linger in places of unproductive silence made him uneasy. Perhaps he was right. Yet silence, I've always found, is where truth rehearses itself before stepping into light. I recognized a few of the figures in the choir stalls, undergraduates mostly, with that faintly superior look of those who believe beauty excuses vanity. The choirmaster, a thin man with fingers like bone, moved his hands as though shaping glass, and there, in the front row, I noticed the warden. Not singing, merely observing, head slightly bowed. To anyone else he might have appeared devout. To me he seemed to be calculating the pitch of propriety. When the rehearsal ended, the chapel exhaled, candles sputtered, hymn books closed in muted rhythm. I waited until the warden emerged. He started when he saw me with a momentary stiffness, soon masked by courtesy. He asked if I was a believer. I said I believed in the persistence of questions which seemed to amuse him. We walked together through the cloister. The air smelled of wax and damp limestone. He spoke of music as moral discipline, how it refines the spirit. I said that in my experience it also conceals it. He gave a small laugh, though I sensed it irritated him. People like the warden dislike being understood too well. As we reached the archway, I mentioned the widow's visit earlier that day. His stride faltered. He said she had come only to return books, nothing more. I remarked that she had also left something behind, an envelope, blue, with his name upon it. He stopped then, only for a breath before answering, that it contained a letter of thanks, a simple courtesy. I told him that courtesies were rarely burnt and never blue. He said nothing further, only touched the edge of his scarf as though adjusting his composure. In that small gesture lay the first confession I would receive in this case. Not spoken, but visible, the trembling precision of a man unaccustomed to improvisation. When he left, I remained under the arch, listening to the faint repetition of the choir practicing again within the chapel. The notes blurred through the stone, each echo slightly delayed, as though memory itself was singing out of time. It was then I noticed the janitor's cupboard door ajar. Inside, the faint glow of a lamp revealed a pair of muddy footprints, small, pointed, unmistakably female. The floor had been cleaned that morning. Whoever had entered did so recently and not by chance. On the shelf, beside a stack of hymnals, lay a folded paper, damp around the edges. It was a page from the college calendar, torn neatly at the date of Markham's death. Someone had circled in pencil the words "Choir Rehearsal, 8 p.m. I replaced it carefully and stepped out into the quadrangle. The sound of the organ swelled, then faded. Across the lawn, a single window in the warden's lodgings still glowed faintly blue, perhaps from lamplight, perhaps from memory. I thought of the widow's trembling hand, the misquoted poet, the gate key that had not been returned. When I reached my rooms, I wrote another line in the notebook, music, as alibi. Warden present. Footprints in the cupboard. Then below it, smaller, more tentative, not faith rehearsal. The whiskey that night tasted of dust and winter fruit. I left the light burning long after the clock had struck midnight, listening to the rain slide down the glass like an afterthought. Oxford slept, but the choir in my head went on singing faultless, unrepentant, and slightly out of tune. The note arrived in the Morning Post, though it bore no address, no date, no signature, only a thin, uneven fold, as if the sender's hands had trembled during the act. It slipped beneath my door, unremarkable in its appearance save for the faint scent of lavender that clung to it, the sort that lingers on drawers lined with old letters. The handwriting was angular, impatient, the kind of script that prefers to finish rather than impress. It read, "The warden is not the only one who feared exposure. Look at what was published and what was not." I stared at it for a long time, listening to the quiet tick of the radiator. The phrasing struck me. The distinction between published and not implied an act of editing, perhaps censorship, or shame. Oxford, after all, thrives on omission as much as on truth. At the porter's lodge, Jenkins claimed he had seen no one near my rooms that morning. I believed him. He is too literal a man for secrecy, too proud of his routine. That meant the note had been delivered under cover of familiarity by someone entitled to walk these corridors without notice. I folded it twice and slipped it into my coat pocket next to the notebook that had begun to resemble a confession written in shorthand. The library seemed the natural place to begin. There is a particular smell there that I have never found elsewhere. Dust, parchment, and the faint metallic tang of forgotten ambition. I asked the assistant for the catalogue of recent publications by college fellows. She pointed me toward a dusty cabinet whose drawers resisted like stubborn witnesses. Markham's name appeared twice, one article on moral aesthetics, another on poetic ethics, but a gap lay between the years. 1987, then nothing until 1990. I asked whether there had ever been a withdrawn piece, perhaps a lecture, never printed. She hesitated. Then, with that peculiar reluctance of the conscientious, she admitted that there had indeed been a paper once scheduled for publication, but retracted at the last minute by the warden's office. Its title was Conscience and the Contradictions of Faith. I thanked her and left. The phrase lingered, weighted with irony. Faith is never comfortable when examined too closely. Outside, the quad shimmered with a weak afternoon sun, the stones still damp from earlier rain. I found myself walking toward the chapel, though I could not have said why. Habit, perhaps, or the knowledge that confession hides best in sacred places. The door stood half open. Inside, the choir boy's book still rested on the pews, open like small, forgotten prayers. I noticed a folded sheet lying near the organ, a draft of the hymn list, written in the same slanted hand as the anonymous note. My heart quickened, though I could not explain why. I compared the two later under my lamp, and the match was certain. Whoever had written that warning now walked freely within the chapel walls. Lewis would have laughed at my preoccupation with handwriting, but handwriting, like morality, reveals what people think they conceal. The angular slant, the uneven pressure, was the hand of someone accustomed to copying rather than creating. A secretary, perhaps, or a scholar, burdened by obedience. That night, I reread the note while the wind pressed gently against the window panes. Look at what was published and what was not. It was not an accusation but a direction. The difference matters. Accusations conceal themselves in anger. Directions conceal themselves in fear. I took out Markham's final paper, the one that had seen light. Its argument revolved around the peril of moral compromise in institutions devoted to virtue. I underlined a passage that struck too close to its author's end. The greatest deceit is often the silence of those who know. A small deduction, perhaps, but enough. The warden had silenced Markham not by censorship, but by shame, and someone, somewhere, was now seeking absolution by proxy. The note still rests in my desk drawer. Sometimes, when the night grows quiet, I can almost smell that faint trace of lavender again. And I wonder whether its author still walks the cloisters, unseen, still haunted by the words they dared not sign. I have never trusted a port. Too heavy, too ceremonial, too easily used as a prop for self-importance. Yet that evening, as I sat across from the warden in his oak-panelled study, a glass of the thing caught the light like a red wound. He had insisted, of course. Tradition demanded it, he said, as though the claret tint could disinfect guilt. I accepted, though I scarcely touched it. The room smelled of wood polish and the faint sweetness of old books, the sort that have absorbed more gossip than knowledge. A fire burned half-heartedly in the grate. The warden sat opposite me, his fingers resting neatly around his own glass, not drinking, only performing the act of holding it. He began speaking of loyalty, of the sanctity of college reputation, of how one must sometimes protect the living rather than canonize the dead. I listened because listening is what people mistake for agreement. He asked whether I believed in justice. I said I believed in symmetry and the balancing of things. His smile was thin. Markham, he said, had lacked balance. Brilliant, but restless. He had wanted to expose hypocrisies within the college, to publish something that would embarrass them all. The phrase embarrassed them all and stayed with me. It was too inclusive, too fearful. I sipped my port then. It tasted metallic, too warm. I told him that Markham's final crossword clue had been a moral examination, 5 letters. The warden looked up sharply, perhaps at the word moral, perhaps at examination. He asked if I'd solved it. I said I had, but that I was more interested in who had written the clue in the first place. He set down his glass a little too carefully, aligning it with the grain of the table. A small tremor passed through his right hand, not the tremor of age, but of restraint. Then he spoke of tradition again, that beautiful shield behind which Oxford hides its worst impulses. He said that some truths, if uttered, can ruin lives undeserving of ruin. I asked whether silence was a lesser sin. He replied that it was the only sin one could survive. The fire crackled, a log shifted. I noticed the decanter beside him, half empty, its neck stained by a small drip of wine that had dried into a dark thread. There was another glass on the sideboard, recently washed, still wet at the rim. He had not been drinking alone. When I rose to leave, he did not stop me, only remarked that I was fond of making people uncomfortable. I told him discomfort was the beginning of honesty. He said that honesty was a dangerous indulgence in institutions built on illusion. I almost agreed. Outside, the air was sharp, scented faintly of frost. The choir's distant rehearsal floated through the night like a prayer that had lost its way. I paused by the cloister, lighting a cigarette. The match flared briefly, illuminating a brass plaque on the wall, gift of the Markham bequest. I exhaled slowly. Back in my room, I poured myself another glass of whiskey, something honest, unpretentious, and unceremonial. I opened my notebook. Port glass, 2 used, 1 guessed, I wrote. Then beneath it, silence, sheer survival. For the first time I felt the outline of the truth, faint but deliberate, like the watermark on college paper. Markham had raised his glass too once, in this same room, and somewhere between the first sip and the last, someone had decided that silence would taste better than confession. I emptied my whiskey, left the port untouched, and listened to the night press itself against the window like a question too late to answer. Lewis was pleased with himself that morning. He believed we had solved it. A quarrel, he said, between colleagues, drink, pride, a shove too far. The warden, faced with disgrace, had struck Markham, then staged a quiet death. Simple, elegant, efficient. And he had evidence, or thought he did. A witness had seen 2 men in the cloister late that evening, one in an academic gown, one bareheaded. A struggle, then silence. I let him talk. His enthusiasm filled the office, warming it in a way the radiator never did. He liked his solutions clean, the world comfortably divided into cause and consequence. But Oxford is not built for clean conclusions. It thrives on the half-light between guilt and innocence. He asked what I thought. I told him I thought we were wrong, though not entirely. The story fit, yes, but it fit too perfectly. Truth, in my experience, never behaves so neatly. It resists symmetry, it leaves edges. We walked together through the drizzle to St. Ambrose. The porter nodded as we passed, though I sensed his curiosity sharpening. Word travels faster through a college than confession through a chapel. The warden was unavailable, said the secretary. which meant he was waiting for us to leave. Lewis sighed, certain I was wasting time. In Markham's study, the air still smelled faintly of smoke. I opened the desk drawer again, knowing exactly what I would find and what I had overlooked. There, among the papers, lay the crossword book, the final page torn out. I had dismissed that before as an accident, but now I ran a finger along the torn edge. It was too even, too deliberate. Someone had removed it cleanly. Lewis said perhaps the warden had taken it, fearing a clue to his guilt. I shook my head. The warden feared exposure, yes, but not discovery. His kind never believe they can be caught. I thought again of the widow, her tremor, her gloves, her careful silences. She had known more than she admitted. Perhaps it was not the warden who visited Markham that night. Perhaps it was her. We left the study and crossed the quadrangle. A sparrow darted between the arches, scattering raindrops. The chapel door was ajar. I went in. The choir books had been cleared, but one remained on the pew, its pages open not to a hymn, but to a penciled note. A single word, Viva. It was not the hand of a boy, it was hers. I recognized the curve of the letter V, the same as in her signature on the donation ledger. She had written it, perhaps without realizing its cruelty. The same word that had haunted me since the first day. A moral examination. Lewis thought it meaningless, of course. He said she might have copied it from a program. He was probably right in the literal sense. But it was a confession all the same, just not the kind the law recognizes. That afternoon, we went to see her. The widow received us in a room lined with photographs and fading flowers. She was calm, almost relieved, as though she had rehearsed this meeting. She said she had visited Markham that night, yes, but only to retrieve letters private, foolish, written in anger. They had argued, certainly, but when she left, he was alive. Lewis pressed her gently. She held his gaze and said that guilt is not always proof of crime. I believed her, or rather, I wanted to. It is dangerous to trust those who speak in truths too polished to question. When we left, the rain had stopped. Lewis was convinced she was lying, that the case was solved after all. He thought she had poisoned Markham slowly, undetectably, poetic in its irony. I said nothing. Back in my room that night, I wrote a single line in the notebook, false symmetry. Real grief. Then, below it, if she killed him, it was by mercy, not malice. The telephone rang. Lewis again, triumphant. In the coroner's report, he said heart failure, natural causes after all. I thanked him and hung up. Then I poured myself a whiskey and sat in the dark, watching the rain return. We had our answer, yes, but it felt like the wrong kind of truth, the kind that comforts everyone except the dead. It was Lewis who used the word examination first. He meant it in the literal sense as an inquiry, an official inquest into Markham's death. But the word lodged in my mind with a different gravity. Perhaps because I had been thinking of that final crossword clue again, of the Viva I had solved too easily. The moral examination. It occurred to me that we had been sitting in the wrong seat all along. The coroner's report lay before me on the desk, its language clinical and apologetic. Cardiac failure, no trace of poison, no sign of struggle. A natural death, tidily boxed, ready for the archives. I stared at it until the words blurred. I have always disliked finality when it arrives without persuasion. It feels less like truth and more like surrender. Lewis was content. He said justice, in this case, meant acceptance. I envied him for it. Acceptance is the privilege of those unburdened by imagination. I told him I would make one last visit to St. Ambrose, purely for my own peace of mind. He said I never had any. The college was unusually quiet. Lent term had ended, the courtyards littered with the scent of wet leaves and the echo of laughter already gone. I walked through the cloisters, each step a soft rebuke against stone. The porter looked up from his ledger and nodded, too weary to ask questions he would rather not answer. Markham's rooms had been cleared, the books boxed, the curtains drawn. Only the faint outline of dust marked where his typewriter had stood. But the desk, that polished slab of walnut, still held something overlooked by the tidy administrators of grief. A folded timetable, his last set of examination papers, bound together with a ribbon. I loosened it. There were notes in the margins, small corrections, brief remarks written in red. One caught my eye. Beside a student's essay on moral philosophy, Markham had written, "You misunderstand the question. It is not whether the act was wrong, but whether the confession was necessary." I sat there for a long time, the meaning flickering faintly like a candle behind frosted glass. Then I understood. Markham's final viva, his moral examination, had not been his own. He had been conducting someone else's. It explained the letter, the meeting, the fear. The widow had come to him not for forgiveness, but for evaluation. She had done something, or thought she had, that required his absolution, and he, with the arrogance of intellect, had granted or denied it. That was the argument that had followed, not over love, but over judgment. The warden's insistence on silence, the blue envelope, the tremor in the widow's hand, each detail now formed its own reluctant harmony. Markham had discovered something he was not meant to know, something not criminal perhaps, but ruinous. He had tested another's conscience, and they had failed, not by murder, but by cowardice. I rose and walked to the window. Outside, the chapel bell struck 6, its echo hollow against the cold air. I thought of the choir boys rehearsing their hymn, of the warden's glass of port, of the widow's gloved hands. Everyone in this case had been sitting for an examination they did not recognize until it was over. I folded the timetable and replaced it on the desk. There was no evidence to take, no confession to record. Only a faint, unprovable truth that the heart can stop not only from weakness, but from knowledge too heavy to bear. When I left the college, dusk had gathered over the rooftops like an afterthought. The porter locked the gate behind me. He asked if the case was closed. I told him it was finished, which is not the same thing. Later, in my room, I opened the crossword book once more. A new clue awaited, judgment deferred 9 letters. I did not fill it in. Some answers, I have learned, are meant to remain unsolved. The whiskey that night was sharp, almost bitter. I drank it slowly, listening to the rain against the window, and wondered whether any of us ever passed the examinations we set for ourselves. The dean's rooms had always seemed to me like a confession chamber disguised as an office, dark-panelled, immaculate and faintly scented of ink and dust. When I entered that afternoon, the curtains were half drawn, and the winter light, filtered through old glass, gave everything the colour of parchment. He was seated at his desk, a neat array of papers before him, each one placed as though its position might absolve him of responsibility. He asked if the case was finished. I told him it was, though even as I said it, the lie felt unnecessary. He had already decided what truth would be recorded. In Oxford, truth is often a matter of administration. He gestured toward the chair opposite. We sat like two men at opposite ends of a bridge neither was willing to cross. He spoke first of duty, of scholarship, of how fragile reputations can be when handled without discretion. He said Markham had been unstable, his final paper ill-judged, his ambitions unsuited to collegial life. His words were measured, but I could hear the fatigue behind them, the kind that seeps into a man when he has lived too long among the half-guilty. I asked if he had read the withdrawn essay, the one on conscience. He said it had been destroyed. I told him I didn't believe him. He smiled a brief, sad smile as though I had reminded him of some youthful arrogance long abandoned. He asked what it mattered now. I said it mattered to Markham. He replied that Markham's concern for conscience had been a form of vanity. I rose, walked toward the bookshelves and looked at the titles. Theology, philosophy, poetry, all arranged alphabetically as if meaning could be filed. On the far end, one volume stood out, a collection of sermons bound in blue leather. I pulled it free. A slip of paper fell from between the pages. I handed it to him without a word. He looked at it as a single sheet, yellowed at the edges, bearing a passage copied by hand. The words were from Augustine. The confession of evil works is the first beginning of good works. The dean folded it slowly, placed it in his pocket, and said that Markham had given him that page years ago. A gift, he called it. I asked if it had been meant as flattery or warning. He didn't answer. The silence that followed was dense, like the air before a storm. I watched his hand move to his glass, not port this time, but water, and tremble slightly before it steadied itself. He said he had always admired Markham's intellect, envied it even. That envy, he said, was what had made him cruel. He had told the warden to withdraw the paper, not because it was dangerous, but because it was true. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, very quietly, he said that Markham had come to see him the night before his death. They had argued not loudly, but with the precision of two men dissecting their own guilt. The dean said he had refused forgiveness, told Markham to destroy his notes and leave Oxford. Markham had left without another word. When I asked whether he felt responsible, the dean said responsibility was an illusion created by those who need meaning. He stood then, walked to the window, and stared out at the empty quad. The light caught his face, tired, pale, stripped of its authority. He said he would resign at the end of term. That illness had made his position untenable. I didn't correct him. I left the room with the sense that something irrevocable had been decided, though not by me. Outside, the sky had darkened to the colour of pewter. The bells of Magdalen drifted faintly across the rooftops, a reminder that Oxford, in its infinite composure, never pauses for remorse. Back in my room, I poured myself a whisky and opened the crossword. The clue that waited for me read, "End of judgment, 4 letters." I thought of Markham, the widow, the warden, and the dean, each of them tested in their own way, each having failed with a kind of grace. I filled in the answer, amen, though even as I wrote it, I knew it was wrong. There are no endings in Oxford, only the quiet continuation of guilt in gentler forms. The glass was empty before I realized it. I remember thinking as I turned out the lamp that perhaps we all live our lives under examination, not for what we've done, but for what we choose not to say.